Jim was a career chief biologist of the Florida Park Service, and through that experience, fell in love with the springs and worked a lot. Ended up being a diver with his wife Tara later on in his years. But in those early years, he just knew their importance and had started to notice and hear things where they're and showing the deterioration. I mentioned before I started in 1986, and shortly thereafter, I got a letter as a District 2 biologist just after we acquired Ocala Springs. I got a letter from Ann Rudlow, who used to run aquatic ecology classes, and she wrote a letter saying that the lower Ocala River, where she had access to, was starting to get a lot of paraphyton on the Ballison area, and it just was looking mucky. That was the first I had really heard alarm notes, and typically Ann was one of the first to see it. Anyway, Jim had been concerned about the springs, and in 1999, after Jeb Bush had been elected, and he had appointed David Strews as the Secretary of DEP, or DNR at the time. It might have been DEP then. And Jim Stevenson's boss was Bob Ballard, who was the Deputy Secretary of DEP. And Jim had convinced Bob that the springs needed attention and needed protection and more needed to be done. And Bob bought into it. Probably through Bob's influence, David Strews agreed to set up a canoe trip that Jim had wanted to get the governor, if possible, and the secretary, the new secretary, out on the Itchtucknee River to look at some of the issues. And I don't know who pulled the right strings, but it turns out that the governor and David Strews and Jim and a small entourage did go out on the Itchtucknee River in canoes, and Jim was able to have one of those teachable moments, which he was good at, and was able to show the governor and David Strews that there was a problem that they needed to address. And because of that, David Strews asked Jim to coordinate what ended up being called to name and coordinate a Florida Springs task force, and then their work was implemented through what's called the Florida Springs Initiative. Let's see, next slide. So the task force, Jim was the task force chairman, and his philosophy was to get everybody in the room. And he invited, and these weren't so much high legislators and commissioners. These were sort of working staff from DEP to DCA, Regional Planning Council, USGS, different parts of DEP, University of Florida, representatives from the 4 water management districts that had springs, a citizen who actually had experience in state government, and different geologists and mostly scientists. Wes Skiles, who was a world-renowned diver who was operating in the state and doing a lot of springs advocacy himself. So it was a real good working group, and they met monthly for a year and developed a report. Next slide. Many of you probably have seen this. It was written prepared for David Strews and the citizens of Florida. And it was a comprehensive plan of action, had 100 recommendations, covering everything from legislation to land use changes. Next slide. So the Springs Task Force broke down the areas of activity that they thought should be covered for successful restoration of the springs. And this was divvied up in different ways in the future by the Springs Initiative. But it's very similar to some of these broad-based approaches you'll see in a lot of the swim plans and other restoration plans. It's purposefully wide to address all aspects. I think this may have been the first time spring basin working groups were proposed. He had already started a working group at Ocala Springs, and this was sort of probably the way he modeled and sort of invented the process. In the working groups, he invited scientists and agency representatives, everybody who could be considered a stakeholder in the room, and held regular meetings. And Jim had a way of talking you into stuff. Is there anybody in here that Jim's talked into anything? Is there anybody who hasn't been talked into anything? Can you get a clipboard and send it around for people who haven't been talked into? So he would do a lot of arm twisting outside, and a lot of the work that happened from the working groups was because the agency representatives went back to their agencies, looked for budget, did projects that would benefit the purpose of the initiative. So that was sort of his model, and he used it here in the Springs Task Force as well. So you can see education, land use planning, land acquisition, each one of these is a huge issue. But he tried to represent the full swath of things that needed doing, and then within each of those in the final report, developed, the task force developed them further. Next slide. Okay, go back, please. So in 2000, so this was in 1999, the report, I forget what date the report was dated, but in 2000, DEP was budgeted $2.5 million from the legislature to grant to projects rated by a committee of experts. So after the task force had completed the report, he developed in-house. By the way, he had left the Division of Recreation Parks before this and had gone into the Division of State Lands within DEP and was doing all this activity from the Division of State Lands. And so it was State Lands is it was a full DEP initiative for a while. And with that $2.5 million, he had a committee, and he asked everybody for proposals to do projects. And they sorted them through and rated them and ranked them and divvied up that $2.5 million, which doesn't sound much compared to nowadays, the millions we're hearing about, but devoted that $2.5 million annually for the next 8 or 9 years. After Jim retired, Mike Bascom took over the leadership of the initiative, and then Connie Bursock after Mike. Jim said that even though it's not listed specifically as a project, he thought one of the biggest results of the initiative and the interest by the legislature was to get land acquisition. He was especially interested in the Itchitucknee Trace projects that bought mining land over the underground conduits leading to Itchitucknee Springs, and there were certainly some other projects like that. All, as I was saying, in the working group model where the individual members went home and worked within their own agencies to further projects. A lot of that stuff was done too by the agencies in the stemming out of the Springs initiative. FWC had a Springs Habitat Restoration funding program. I see Kent and Ron left. I don't think that's active anymore, but it might be. Lots of MFLs were established. You probably know the whole MFL story, but MFLs were not done for decades after they were supposed to be done. And finally, with pressure like this, because the springs were so important, a lot of the MFL work started rolling with all 5 water management districts, and the springs were declared in the legislature as being priority for MFL development. In that time, in 2008, DEP decided that 0.35 milligrams per liter standard was important, and that was developed and that was followed up in a lot of the restoration work and BMAP efforts. Let's see. About of the 50 springs the agency was monitoring, 3/4 exceeded that level at the time. So, during that time, DEP was enthusiastic about this, and interim reports. Here's an interim report for, which I don't have a date for, and there's another one I lost back there somewhere. DEP was bragging on all the springs work it was doing during this time, and all the dashboards and other performance measures the department was claiming included prominence for springs work. However, at the start of the Scott administration, the Springs Initiative was slowly defunded and disbanded, and the spring working group shut down, and spring ambassadors, that was another sort of unique thing that's not listed here, except I guess within one of those categories. There were maybe 4 springs that had named ambassadors, which was an OPS staff position, and the ambassadors pretty much work on their own to go out to the neighborhoods around the springs and drum up public interest and support and do cleanup projects. And some of them were remarkable. Annette Long has been mentioned; she was one. Cal Jameson up in Ocala was another. So they did great work. Anyway, those positions were terminated, and it pretty much dropped to nothing. Although in 2011, DEP I think asked in the legislature for $3 million for spring-specific restoration projects, and from that point on, springs funding continued. The different part of DEP was receiving the springs money, and they were asking for project lists, but it shifted to all the project lists started coming from the water management districts, which are good projects and certainly needed a lot of money, but in any case, that was the demise of this regulation. The focus was to reduce stormwater runoff into these surface runoff into these water bodies, and to do habitat restoration projects. That was sort of the focus of the program, and is still stated to be on the DEP website. So the rainbow swim plan, I asked Bob, well, which swim plans do you want me to focus on? And he said, well, rainbow's a good one. So I looked it up, and it turns out Eric DeHaven's already talked a little bit about it. I will not mention too much. Do the next slide. It was adopted in March of 2016, and it was, I think, unique under swim plans, and maybe it would be a good model for the future. But what it did was, first of all, it added water quantity to the mix for consideration, and of course, it was a multi-spring initiative. The Rainbow Swim Plan was part of this crystal, can't find it in my notes, but the Springs Coast initiative. So they met with, and the swim plans prior to that were supposed to be what the Water Management District itself was responsible for doing. But the Rainbow Springs Plan, the swim plan, included all these other agencies and entities to do work too. So it was much more of a consortium effort than previous swim plans. So there was a leadership committee, the Springs Coast Steering Committee. Members included commissioners from the City of Crystal River, Citrus County, Hernando County, Marion County, and representatives sort of at the division director level or assistant division director level from DEP, FWC, DAX, and SWIFMUD. And then they also had a Springs Coast Management Committee, which was the working group that had a lot of the scientists on it. And then they also had a technical working group, which was specifically asked to recommend technical issue goals. Of course, one of the good things they had was quantifiable objectives. Eric already mentioned the water clarity with the second disc of 100 feet. Nitrate concentrations are using that same DEP standard of 0.35 milligrams per liter. So there's the water quantity, which is not typical in a swim plan, minimum flows to be established in 2016. And then the typical natural system targets, with submerged aquatic vegetation in the river being greater than 65% and invasives being less than 10%. As you know, the rainbow has a lot of issues with bearing from trampling, and they have some exotic issues as well. The swim plan includes 26 ongoing projects and 7 proposed priority projects. By the way, this swim plan was really an update of a 2004, I think, swim plan, and but it added a lot. So currently it has 26 ongoing and 7 proposed projects for water quality issues, 19 ongoing and 2 proposed priority projects for water quantity issues, and 8 ongoing and 2 proposed priority projects for natural system issues. So it's a very aggressive swim plan, but a lot of the work that happens in these systems is using the swim plan as an impetus for action. I do want to compliment the water management districts. It's great to be able to go online and find these technical reports. So good job to the water management district, and keep it up.